Hello and welcome back. In this section we'll build our first Ionic app, and in the process we'll learn quite a few things like how to create a project, how to use some Ionic components, customize their styles, and so on. The app we're going to create is a simple game, a pretty silly game as well if you like. It's called Love Calculator. Maybe you've played some variant of this game as a kid, or maybe not. But here's an example online. This is just one of the many websites that offer something similar. It's really nothing complicated. You just enter the names of two persons, say Romeo and Juliet, and it will calculate a percentage, like 38% in this case, that supposedly means how much these two persons love each other, or the compatibility between them, or something like that. Like I said, it's just a silly game. There is no scientific value to it, of course. But I think it's good as a first example of an app, precisely because it's so simple. And at the same time, it's also something you could well publish as a mobile app. If you search the app stores, you'll find many apps of this sort, like this one on Google Play. You can see that it had somewhere between 10 and 50 million installs on Android. So it may be a silly game, but it's also quite popular apparently. Anyway, once again, the main point is that it will allow us to learn the basics of using the Ionic framework. In the next video, we'll get started by creating a new project using the Ionic CLI, or Command Line Interface. I'll see you later. Hello and welcome back. It's time to start writing our first app, that is the Love Calculator. Before we begin, I suggest you keep the Ionic docs open somewhere because we'll use this documentation for reference. So just open a new browser tab and go to ionicframework.com/docs/v2. We'll come back to these docs later. Now, the first step to develop an Ionic app is to create a new project, as you might guess. And we can do that by using the Ionic CLI, that's the Command Line Interface. So open a terminal or command prompt if you're on Windows, and make sure you are in the folder where you want to keep your projects. On my machine, I created an Ionic 2 folder, but you can choose a different location, of course. We can generate a new project by typing Ionic start and then the name of the project folder, let's say love-calculator. To use Ionic 2, we need to pass the v2 flag, that's --v2. Don't forget this option, otherwise it will create an Ionic 1 project that is quite different. Optionally, we can also specify a template with the --template option. And for most of our examples, we'll use the blank template that will generate a very basic Ionic app with a single page. Now, this may take a little while because it needs to download a bunch of stuff, so I'll use some video editing magic to fast forward this bit. Right, once it's done, you should have created a new folder called Love Calculator. There it is. Now we want to go into that folder using the cd command and also open this project in an editor. I use Visual Studio Code and I can open it simply by typing code and the current folder. But you can use a different editor, of course. As you can see, the project contains quite a few files and folders, but we'll look at them in a second. Before we get to that, we want to run another command in our terminal to start our application for local development. And we can do that by typing Ionic serve. This will take a few seconds to build our project the first time, and then you should open a new browser tab with our application. There it is. So this is our initial Ionic app. You can see that it has a header bar saying Ionic blank, because we generated it from the blank template. In the next video, we'll have a look at this generated project. I'll see you later. Hello and welcome back. Let's do a quick overview of this project that was generated by the Ionic start command. I'm not going to explain to you what each single folder and file is for, because that would be quite boring. We'll see that, but gradually over the course. For now, let's just focus on this source folder, written SRC for short. This is where we keep our application code, so it's also where we'll spend most of our time making changes and adding new code. Inside source, we have a pages folder that contains a home folder, and this in turn has three files: HTML, SCSS, and TS, that is TypeScript. If we look at home.html, this contains pretty much what we're seeing in the browser. You can see that it has various Ionic specific tags like Ion header, Ion navbar, and so on. All these tags are simply Angular components provided by Ionic. They all start with the Ion prefix, so it's easy to distinguish them from our own components. We'll look at many Ionic components in more detail over time, but you can easily see that this Ionic blank title is what we see in the top bar. And what's inside Ion content is also the same text we see in the browser, of course. Let's try changing something. We can replace the title to be Love Calculator and maybe put it into a single line just to save some space. As soon as we save this file, the app reloads automatically and we see our new title displayed. So this automatic refresh is taken care of by the Ionic serve command that we have running in the terminal. Now, this HTML file is simply an Angular template that is associated with the homepage component defined in home.ts. You can see that it has the @component annotation just like any other Angular component. The class name is homepage and it uses home.html as its template. An Ionic page is basically an Angular component. So why is it called page and not component, you may ask? Well, a page is basically a component that represents a screen of our application, if you like. In Ionic, they are called pages by convention, and they are a bit special in that you can navigate to a page using the Ionic navigation controller. We'll cover navigation in more detail later in the course. In this example, we just need a single page, but as a quick overview, if we look at the app folder, there is an app.component.ts, and this is the root component of our application. It's an Angular component called My App, but the interesting thing is that its template uses this Ion nav component, setting its root property to root page that is set to home page down here. If you're familiar with the Angular router, you can think of Ion nav as similar to router outlet. It's where our home page will be inserted. Again, we'll talk about this more later, but in an Ionic app, we don't use the Angular router because Ionic provides its own navigation mechanism that is designed specifically for mobile applications. So this is our root component, and like any other Angular application, we also have an app module. This is an ng module similar to what you have in a typical Angular web application. However, for Ionic, we use the Ionic module instead of browser module, and we pass my app, that is our root component, to Ionic module for root. Ionic module is imported from Ionic Angular. That's the package that contains all the Ionic functionality. Also, we bootstrap this Ionic app component that's also imported from the same module. We don't need to worry too much about the details here because the Ionic CLI generates all this boilerplate for us, but I just want you to understand that an Ionic app is basically an Angular application with only a few differences. In fact, if we look at this main file, it's using Platform Browser Dynamic to bootstrap our app module exactly like an Angular web application. Finally, if we look at index.html, we can see that it's a basic HTML page. It imports some JavaScript and CSS files. Again, we don't need to worry about exactly how it works because it's all taken care of by the Ionic scripts for us. But the important point is that we have this Ion app tag here. Ion app is the selector matching the Ionic app component that we bootstrap in our app module. So an Ionic project always has Ion app in its index.html where the application will be rendered. Right, at this point we should know just enough about this project to be able to start adding our own functionality, and that's what we'll do in the next video. I'll see you later. Hello and welcome back. Now that we had a quick look at the code generated by the Ionic start command, let's customize this app a bit more. Let me open the Chrome Developer Tools so we can see if there are any messages in the console. You'll see a warning here saying Cordova is not available, but that's absolutely normal when running the application with Ionic Serve, because Cordova is only available when we run our app on iOS or Android as a proper mobile app. We'll talk more about Cordova later in the course. Now let's go back to implementing our love calculator. This gray bar at the top, maybe it looks a bit too serious for this app that is pretty much a game. We could make it a bit more colorful. So let's see how we can change the color of the header bar. On the Ion navbar component, we can set the color attribute and pass, for example, primary, that represents the primary color in the Ionic theme. And as you can see, the primary color by default is blue. Now, how do we know which colors are available? Let's go to the Ionic documentation page. Let me maximize this window so you can see better. If we click on UI components, we can find some documentation for each component, including this nice preview frame that looks like a phone here on the right. One way to see the color palette is to look at buttons. Here we can see what an Ionic button looks like, but also there's an example for each color, and these 5 colors you see here are the color palette defined in the default Ionic theme. There is a light color that is light gray by default. There's a primary color, that's the blue we've seen in our header bar. It says default here because it's the default color for a button, but as we've seen, we can use it by setting color to primary. The secondary color is green, danger is red, and dark is almost black. So if we go back to our code and set the color to danger, can you remember which color we will actually see? There you go, it's red. So why is it called danger if it's red? Why not just call it red? Well, that's because danger means red in the default theme, but we can define our own theme colors and decide that danger in our app should be displayed as yellow, for example. This is something that Ionic makes really easy to do. Let's see how it works. Let me reset this color to primary first. And if we look inside the source theme folder, there is this variables.scss file. This is where we can override the default colors and also other properties like fonts and so on. This is an SCSS file. Ionic uses Sass for styling, and Sass is a CSS preprocessor. That means that this file will be transformed by Sass into regular CSS styles that will then be loaded by the browser. So an SCSS file is similar to a CSS file, but it provides a more powerful syntax. For example, you can declare variables that you can then use later in your styles. Colors are defined down here. you can see that the primary is set to 387EF5, which is the RGB notation that corresponds to the blue we see in the header bar. Let's change it to a dark green, for example. That should be 00 for red, say 99 for green, and 00 for blue. Save, and the Ionic serve process will recompile all SCSS files to use our new variable values, and our header bar is now green. It's not just the bar, if you notice, the docs link is also green in the content where it says the docs will be your guide. So the color we set as primary will affect multiple things. If we set it to something else, like yellow to use a named color, of course our header bar will change accordingly. Now yellow is probably not the best choice, so let me revert back to the default value, that is this nice blue. We'll simply use the default theme values in the rest of this example, but be aware that you can fully customize the Ionic theme if you like, and this is a great feature of Ionic because you probably don't want your app to look exactly like all the other apps created with Ionic. Enough about theming for now. In the next video, we'll add some actual content to our app. I'll see you later. Hello and welcome back. It's time to add our own content to this app, replacing this generated text that says the world is your oyster. So let's get rid of this HTML code. Incidentally, you may wonder why we need this Ion content tag. What Ion content provides is support for scrolling. Remember, we're writing a mobile app, and mobile phones may have smaller screens compared to laptops or desktop computers. So it's more likely that our content won't fit into the screen and the user will need to be able to scroll down. Now, of course, any regular web page allows scrolling as well, but in this case, we don't want everything to scroll. Our header should always be visible at the top. It's only the content that should be scrollable. That's why Ionic provides these Ion header and Ion content components. That said, what should we add here? Well, our love calculator will need a couple of input fields where the user can enter the names of the two persons for which to calculate how much they love each other, right? So let's go to the Ionic components documentation. Let me put a full screen so you can see the preview in the phone frame as well. The components we're interested in are inputs. So here's the first example of input fields. The nice thing about this preview frame is that we can also interact with it. So here we can enter some text. You can see that this is a basic input field with some placeholder text. But if we scroll down, there are other examples of possible ways we can use inputs. Like we can have fixed labels. So in this case, username is a fixed label that always stays on the left, while we can enter a value on the right. Or we can use floating labels. Let's see how these work. In this case, username looks like a placeholder, but when we put the focus on the field, the label moves up and becomes smaller with a nice animation effect. And here we can type whatever we like. I quite like these floating labels. Let's use this example. So let's copy this code snippet. Let's go back to our editor and paste it here. Let me indent this properly and remove the empty lines just so that I can fit more code that you can see on the screen. If we save this, we can see the input fields saying username and password, and if we click on the field, the label floats above the field. Good. Now let's look at this code that we just copied and pasted. It's not just two input fields, we have an Ion list. So this is a list component used to display one or more rows of content. And each row is wrapped by an Ion item component. Displaying things in rows is very common, of course, especially in mobile apps. So ion list together with ion items is something we'll use very often. Each item contains an ion label and an ion input. These Ionic components are very similar to the standard HTML label and input elements. But of course, a standard HTML label doesn't have a floating attribute providing that nice animation effect. So that's an example of extra functionality provided by the Ionic components, but they also take care of styling these elements so that they look more like native mobile widgets. Now, of course, for our love calculator, we don't need username and password. We want, let's say, name1 and name2. The second input should also be of type text. Note that we can set a type attribute on an ion input component, just like with a regular HTML input element. Right, at this point we can enter two names like Romeo and Juliet. And that's pretty much all we can do right now. So our next step will be to add some more components here to display the results of calculating the love score between these two names. We'll see how to do that in the next video, but as an exercise, if you like, you can try doing it yourself first, because you've seen pretty much how it works. We can look at the Ionic documentation, find some suitable component to display what we want, and simply copy and modify the example, right? So here, after the inputs, we'll want to display a card component. That's what you need to look up in the Ionic docs. And a card can have a header where you can display Romeo and Juliet just as placeholder text for now. And as the content, we'll display the result of our calculation, for example, 99%. So see if you can do this on your own, and we'll see a solution in the next video. I'll see you later. Hello and welcome back. So did you manage to do the mini exercise I left you with at the end of the previous video and add a card component to our app? Let's see how we can do that. Let's open our trusted documentation page and look for cards. Here's a basic card. It's just a box with a raised border essentially. But we can also have a header inside the card, like in this example. So let's copy this code snippet and go and paste it into our page template. Now, instead of header, we want to say Romeo and Juliet, just as a placeholder. We should really show whatever the user enters into our input fields, but we'll do that later. As for the card content, let's remove this text. Here we'll display the love score, for example, 99%. Let's save this file, and that's our card. Pretty simple. Now, maybe it will look nicer if we center the text inside the card. To do that, we can simply add the text center attribute to Ion card. Save, and there you go. It's centered. That's better. What's this text center attribute, you may ask? Text center is a utility attribute provided by Ionic. You can find it in the documentation under utility attributes. There are a few of those for common styling requirements like aligning text. Another styling improvement we could make is increase the size of the text showing 99%. Because that's the result of our calculation, so it's the most important piece of information in this app, if you like. We can use regular CSS styles, of course. In fact, we can even use inline styles. Just as a quick example, we could set the font size to 200%, that is twice as big as the default size. And there you go. That's certainly more visible. However, using inline styles is usually not a good practice, especially if you want to apply the same style in more than one place. So we could define a new CSS class instead. Let's say we have a class called score, where score is this percentage number. Now, where do we define the rules for this style class? If we look at our project structure, we have this home.scss file that was generated for us. This is where we can put styles specific to our home page. Note that it says page home here, which is the same value as the selector declared in our home page component. When Angular renders this home page component, it will use the selector as the tag name in the HTML. We can see that if we inspect the elements in the browser. Let me open the DevTools as a separate window, otherwise it's a bit difficult to see. So here we have Ion app, which is the tag we use in index.html that matches the Ionic app component, that is what we bootstrap in our app module. Inside Ion app, we can see an ng component with class appRoot. Angular renders an ng component tag whenever we have a component that doesn't have a selector property. This is actually the myApp component, that's the root component of our application. Then we have IonNav, that's what's in the root components template. And inside it, we have page home. So this page home is our rendered home page component. Inside page home, we have Ion header and Ion content and so on. So Ionic uses this page home tag to encapsulate styles specific to this page. Let me put the DevTools back at the bottom. Right. So remember that this selector here is important because it's used for styling. Home.scss is a Sass file, and one of the extra features available with Sass compared to plain CSS is that we can nest selectors. So we can add .score here inside page home, and this way it will only apply to those elements that are inside the page home tag and have class score. Now we can actually declare the style that is simply font size 200%. And that works. So Ionic follows this convention where each page has an SCSS file with the same name, and every rule in that file is wrapped inside page dash and the page name, and that needs to match the component selector. This way we can isolate the styles for each page. Isolate in the sense that we could have another page that declares its own score class, but with different rules, and that style wouldn't interfere with the home page. Right, so at this point, we always display Romeo and Juliet, which is correct if we actually enter Romeo and Juliet in the input fields, but if we enter different names, like, I don't know, Tarzan and Jane, then the card should also show Tarzan and Jane, of course. So the next step is to bind our input fields to some properties that are then displayed in the card. If you are comfortable with Angular property binding, you can try doing this yourself as an exercise if you feel like. There's nothing really specific to Ionic you need to know. You can just use the Angular ng model directive. But in any case, we'll see how to do that in the next video. I'll see you later. Hello and welcome back. In this video, we'll see how to add some property bindings. What we want is that if we type something into the name1 field, like Joe, then we should see Joe displayed here inside the card instead of Romeo. If you've done that already as an exercise and it works, well done. In any case, we'll go through the solution now. So we want to bind this input field. Actually, let me do something. I'll split this editor window so we can open the TypeScript file at the top, like that, and keep the HTML template below. This way we can see both the component class and the template at the same time. Right. We can also simplify this TypeScript code a little bit because we don't need to inject the nav controller. The nav controller is used for navigation, but we have a single page in this app. There's no other page to navigate to. So let's get rid of it and the import as well. Now we need some properties in our class to keep the data that we use in the template. So we want name1, that's initially an empty string, and name2. And then let me save this file first. At this point, we want to associate this field with the name1 property. And just like with regular Angular applications, we can use the ngModel directive to do that. We put ngModel inside square brackets and parentheses to create a two-way binding between the value of this input field and the name1 property of our component class. This is also known as the banana in a box syntax. Then we can do exactly the same thing for the other input, except this one will be bound to the name2 property. So now, instead of Romeo and Juliet, we can display the value of the name1 property. We use double curly braces to denote an expression that will be interpolated. Then we can write and name2 in double curly braces. If we save this, now when we type something like Juliet, this is reflected in what's displayed inside the card. And if we type Romeo in the second field, the card shows Juliet and Romeo. So that's the Angular two-way binding mechanism in action. When we change the field value, that updates the property bound to that field, and the new value is reflected in the interpolated expression. Hopefully you should already be familiar with these concepts. Something that's not ideal right now is that when the fields are empty, we just see "and" inside the card. That's not a very good user experience. It's not clear what "and" on its own means there. As a quick fix, we could say if name1 is empty, then display some question marks, for example. If name1 is an empty string, that's a falsy value in JavaScript, so we can write name1 or a string with 3 question marks. And same thing for name2. Right, so now we see question marks and question marks. That at least gives the idea that the names are not known yet. When we do enter some values, like again Romeo and Juliet, those values replace the question marks. Good. Now the last bit of functionality we need is to actually calculate this score, where at the moment we always display 99%. We'll see how to do that in the next video, but if you want to, you can start thinking about how we could implement a simple algorithm that, given 2 names, returns a number, and this number should be between 0 and 100 because we show it as a percentage. I'll see you later. Hello and welcome back. Our Love Calculator app is almost complete, except that we're missing its main feature, that is calculating the love score. We can enter whatever names we like, say Juliet and Romeo, but we'll always get 99% as the result right now because it's hard-coded here. So how can we calculate this percentage number? First of all, we'll need a property in our class representing the score. Let's set it to 42 just as an example. And then we can display that score property here in the template. Instead of 99, we show the value of score followed by the percent sign. And now it shows 42%, of course. But we want this score to be calculated, so using a property is not the right approach. We'll need a function. Thankfully, JavaScript also supports getter methods, which means we can rewrite this property as getScore, that is a method with no parameters, and in the method body we can calculate and return the result. Let's return 77 for now, just to show a different number. If we save this, you can see that it's displaying 77% in the browser. Note that we didn't change anything in the template, we're still evaluating score like a property. But since we have this getter, the value of score will be calculated by calling this method, right? At this point, we can actually implement the calculation. What we need to do, as mentioned at the end of the previous video, is return a number between 0 and 100, because we display it as a percentage. And this number needs to be based on the two names that have been entered into the input fields. Also, if you enter the same two names multiple times, you should always get the same result, of course. We cannot just generate a random number each time, otherwise it wouldn't be believable. So how can we generate a number based on name 1 and name 2? Well, the name properties are strings, and if we take a string, say Romeo, in JavaScript we can call the char_code_at method to get the code for a certain character. For example, char_code_at0 gives 82, that is the ASCII code for the uppercase R letter. char_code_at_index1 returns 111, that is the code for the letter O, and so on. So we could use these character codes to calculate our number. Let's give it a try. The result should be based on both names, so let's add a variable, say letters, that's just the name1 and name2 properties concatenated together. I'm also going to normalize the string by calling to lowercase. The same letter of the alphabet will have a different code depending on whether it's uppercase or lowercase, but we probably don't want to generate a different result just because the user enters the same name but with different case. Again, that would make our game less believable. Now that we have all the letters, we could calculate the sum of their character codes. So start from sum equals 0, then iterate over each letter. So for an index going from 0 up to the letter's length and incrementing by 1. In the loop, we want to add to the sum variable the value of each character, that is letters char_code_at_index I, right? Let's try returning this sum just to see what it looks like. Initially it's 0. If we type Juliet and Romeo, you can see that the number increases at every letter we type, and we end up with 1199%. Now, given different names, we get a different number, and that is good, but obviously 1199% doesn't make sense. We want a number between 0 and 100. How could we limit this number to be in that range? An easy way to do that is to use the modulo operator. We can return sum modulo 101. So this will be the remainder of dividing sum by 101, and the result can only be between 0 and 100. 0 means that sum is perfectly divisible by 101, while the maximum remainder we can get is 100. We're putting math to good use here. Let's see how this works. With Romeo and Julie, we get 73%, but with Juliet, we get 88%. So that proves that different names give different results. Let's do some other tests. If we type Juliet all uppercase, we still get 88%, so the case doesn't matter. Good. And if we swap the two names, putting Juliet first and Romeo second, maybe all lowercase as well, we still get 88%. Right. So at least we're consistent in the way we generate the result. We all know that it's just a silly game anyway. There's no real meaning to this number. I mean, if this result was true, surely for Romeo and Juliet we should get 100%, right? They are arguably the most famous lovers in history. Well, actually, thinking about it, the Romeo and Juliet story was set in Verona, Italy, so maybe we should enter their original Italian names Romeo is still Romeo, but Juliet was actually Giulietta. And look at that, we do get 100% in that case. So maybe there is some truth to this algorithm that we just made up. I'm just kidding, of course. Anyway, we could say that our app is now complete, but we could do some more styling improvements, like using Ionicons that are icons provided by Ionic. And that's what we'll do in the next video. I'll see you later. Hello and welcome back. To finish off our Love Calculator app, I just want to make it a bit more colorful by adding an icon, which is of course also an excuse to show you how to use icons with Ionic. Here where we display the names, like as usual Romeo and Juliet, instead of the word and, we can show a heart symbol to mean love. Ionic provides a beautiful icon set called Ionicons. Let's go and find it in the documentation. If we go back to home, we can see there's a section called Ionicons. So these are all the available icons provided by Ionic. It's quite a long list, so I'm not going to show you all of them. What I want you to notice is that there are different variants for each icon. There's an iOS style, an iOS outline one, and one for material design. That's the style used by Android. We also have a very convenient search box here. So to find a suitable icon, we can just search for heart, for example, and that will show any icons matching that keyword. As you can see, there is an icon named heart, which is exactly what we want. If we click on the icon name, we even get this pop-up window showing a code sample. So all we need to do is copy this line, close everything, go back to our editor, and paste our heart icon between name 1 and name 2. Let me split this into multiple lines so it doesn't overflow out of the screen. As you can see, to display an icon, we use the Ion icon component that has a name attribute where we simply pass the name of the icon, like heart in this case. And if we save this, there's our heart icon. It's black by default, the same color as the text, but we can change the color if you want to, just like we did with the navbar in the header. We can add a color attribute, and I'm going to use the danger color that, if you remember, corresponds to red in the default theme. So we get this nice little red heart icon. And if we enter something like, again, Juliet and Romeo, we see Juliet heart Romeo. Sweet. As a final observation, if you remember when we looked at the Ionicons documentation, there were different variants for iOS and Android or material design. What's that for? To understand that, we can enable device mode in the Chrome developer tools. This way, Chrome will emulate a mobile device and we can select different models. Let's start with the Nexus 6P, that is an Android device. I need to zoom in a little bit, otherwise it's just too small. And let me refresh the page as well to make sure it detects that we're pretending to be an Android device. What we're seeing now is the material design style. It's actually exactly the same that we've seen so far, because material design is the default platform style in Ionic. But notice how, for example, the title is aligned to the left, and if we focus an input field, there's a little blue line underneath. After we enter a value, the input line becomes green. They're all small things, but let's see what happens if we select iPhone 6 instead. Again, let me zoom in and refresh the page. You can see that the title text is now centered and not left aligned like on Android. The font is also different if you pay close attention. If we edit the field, there is no colored line at the bottom. As for the icon, the heart is also slightly different now, although it may be difficult to spot in this case because the difference is quite small. Anyway, what this shows is that Ionic automatically applies different styles depending on which platform our app is running on. And this feature plays a big part in making sure that our app looks like a native mobile app. This should also give you a better understanding of why it's important to use Ionic components whenever possible. So tags like Ion header, Ion title, and so on, rather than standard HTML elements. It may seem overkill to have 3 custom components here just to render the title bar, but keep in mind that each Ionic component supports different styles and automatically adapts to the platform we're running on. As a side note, this device mode available with the Chrome developer tools is quite convenient for testing styles, but be aware that it's very different from running your app in the Android emulator or the iOS simulator. Chrome is simulating an iPhone here, but only in the sense that the window size reflects the iPhone screen size, and it's sending a user agent header to the server pretending to be an iPhone. But in this mode, we don't have access to any native iOS functionality, of course. For that, we'll need to use the iOS simulator that comes with Xcode. And same thing for Android, we'll need the emulator that comes with the Android SDK. We'll talk more about the tools required to build our app for Android and iOS later in the course. Anyway, that's it for our Love Calculator app. We can say that it is now complete. So far, we've been running our app in the browser using the local development server started by the Ionic serve command. In the next section, we'll see how to build and deploy our app as a website or progressive web app. I'll see you later.